June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. In a modest recreation hall far from the American mainland, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald paused mid-game. A checkerboard lay partially played between him and Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer for Satan's Angels. At the doorway, a man in civilian clothes had introduced himself, but the name initially failed to register. MacDonald's focus remained on the board until the visitor spoke again, his calm confidence prompting MacDonald to finally register who he was addressing. Charles Lindbergh. Not just any aviator, but the pilot whose transatlantic flight had made him an icon. Now, thousands of miles from the United States, he had arrived to offer his expertise on P-38 Lightning combat operations. The encounter seemed casual, yet the knowledge Lindbergh would share over the coming 6 weeks would dramatically redefine the operational limits of America's premier twin-engine fighter. By applying precise fuel management and flight techniques, Lindbergh enabled pilots to nearly double the P-38's effective combat radius, turning what had once been considered impossible into standard procedure. This achievement was not solely technical. It represented a profound shift in military practice. Pilots, initially trained to rely on intuition and standard doctrine, learned to trust calculations and disciplined fuel management. A single civilian, untested on this specific aircraft until just days prior, became the catalyst for a transformation in the Pacific aerial campaign. Lindbergh's authority in extended range flight had its roots in an earlier landmark accomplishment. On May 2021, 1927, he completed a solo flight from New York to Paris in the Ryan NYP monoplane, Spirit of St. Louis. Carrying 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so massive they obscured the forward view, Lindbergh navigated using dead reckoning and a periscope. He landed with roughly 85 gallons remaining, demonstrating a level of fuel efficiency previously deemed unattainable for a radial engine aircraft. The meticulous attention to fuel economy that he displayed on that flight became the foundation of his expertise. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, conducting survey flights for Pan American Airways over both the Atlantic and Pacific, Lindbergh honed techniques for maximizing aircraft range. He recognized that manufacturer-published figures for range were averages, not hard limits. Every engine functioned best within an optimal window where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical stress aligned perfectly. Discovering that window demanded a deep understanding of manifold pressure, propeller RPM, fuel mixture, and airspeed far beyond standard military or civilian pilot instruction of the time. By the early 1940 seconds, Lindbergh had earned recognition as one of the world's leading authorities on long-distance flight. Yet his pre-war political isolationism complicated his relationship with the United States military. Despite this, his skills proved indispensable once applied to the challenges of the Pacific theater. Through rigorous observation, hands-on demonstration, and incremental experimentation, Lindbergh taught P-38 pilots to manage engines in ways previously unimagined. The result was a transformative shift in aerial strategy, where careful calculation replaced instinct, extending the reach and effectiveness of American fighter operations across vast oceanic distances. What unfolded in that small hall at Hollandia was not just a lesson in aviation, it was the embodiment of applied mathematics, precision engineering, and human discipline converging to alter the course of the war in the Pacific. Before the United States entered World War II, Charles Lindbergh had emerged as one of the nation's most prominent isolationists. As a leading figure in the America First Committee, he vocally opposed American intervention in European conflicts, drawing the ire of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Tensions escalated when Roosevelt publicly likened Lindbergh to Clement Vallandigham, a known Confederate sympathizer during the Civil War. In response, Lindbergh relinquished his commission as a colonel in the Army Air Reserve on April 29, 1941. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in the U.S. entry into the war, Lindbergh sought to return to military service, but Roosevelt personally ensured that he would not be allowed to wear a U.S. uniform again. Undeterred, Lindbergh redirected his efforts to a civilian role, applying his aviation expertise to support aircraft production and development. By 1943, he was working with United Aircraft Corporation, focusing on the company's Chance Vought division, which produced the 4U Corsair. He also contributed to Ford's Willow Run plant, addressing production difficulties with the B-24 Liberator. In addition, Lindbergh participated in high-risk, high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts to study engine performance and helped refine dive bombing tactics for the Corsair. Though his technical work was highly impactful, Lindbergh yearned for operational experience in combat. An opportunity arose in early 1944 when United Aircraft expressed interest in studying twin-engine fighters in a combat environment, particularly the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the only American fighter in that category. Lindbergh persuaded the company to send him to the Pacific Theater as a technical observer to evaluate the P-38 in active combat. Preparing for deployment on April 3, 1944, he acquired a naval officer's uniform without rank insignia from Brooks Brothers in New York. At Brentano's bookstore, he purchased a compact New Testament, noting in his journal that, given the constraints of carrying only a single small book, it was his preferred choice, a reflection of his growing appreciation for its content over time. Officially, Lindbergh's mission was to visit Marine Corps aviation bases near Guadalcanal, and the Navy Department authorized the trip, though the White House remained unaware. Neither Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox knew he was headed into an active war zone. Once in the Pacific, Lindbergh's observation assignment quickly expanded when Marine Corps pilots invited him to participate in combat missions. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first mission, a strafing run near a Japanese garrison at Rabaul with Marine Fighting Squadron 222. Although designated an observer, Lindbergh actively engaged targets when possible, demonstrating hands-on skill that surpassed theoretical knowledge. His insights into aircraft performance and operational safety proved invaluable. Lindbergh collaborated with Corsair pilots to develop techniques for safely taking off with bomb loads that exceeded the aircraft's official specifications, drastically reducing accidents caused by overweight takeoffs while enhancing the squadron's strike capacity. News of his involvement spread across the Pacific Theater. A famed aviator was flying combat missions as a civilian while solving operational challenges that had confounded military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had turned his attention to the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was genuine, but Lindbergh also sought experience with the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, one of the Pacific's most accomplished P-38 units. On June 15, 1944, he traveled to Finchin, New Guinea, and checked in with 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab, where he met Colonel Marion Cooper for lunch. On June 18, he dined with General Ennis Whitehead to discuss the situation in New Guinea and outline his plans to observe P-38 operations. While formal authorization was minimal and unofficial, the Southwest Pacific Theater's flexible command structure allowed skill and connections to carry significant weight. Lindbergh completed his initial P-38 check flight with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group on June 20, spending an hour and 20 minutes familiarizing himself with the distinctive twin-boom fighter. By June 26, he had arrived at Hollandia and met with Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, a 29-year-old ace with 10 confirmed victories and commander of the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943. The 475th, one of the theater's highest-scoring P-38 units, operated 3 squadrons, the 430 Honest, 430 Twund, and 433rd, all flying the upgraded P-38J model equipped with improved intercoolers and increased fuel capacity. Through this period, Lindbergh's involvement bridged technical expertise and operational observation, blending civilian ingenuity with frontline combat insight, a rare convergence that had a tangible impact on both aircraft performance and pilot effectiveness in the Pacific Theater. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was among the longest-range fighter aircraft deployed in the Pacific Theater, designed for missions that other fighters simply could not undertake. Even when equipped with auxiliary drop tanks, however, the P-38's effective operational radius remained constrained. Flights to distant enemy positions often left pilots with minimal reserves for aerial combat, forcing many to return to base dangerously low on fuel. Several aircraft had been lost entirely when unexpected weather conditions required rerouting beyond the aircraft's fuel endurance. Initially, MacDonald gave Lindbergh only a polite nod, returning quickly to his ongoing checkers game, seeming uninterested. But the conversation shifted when Lindbergh clarified that General Hutchinson, commanding the 3rd Air Task Force, had specifically sent him to discuss tactical operations involving the P-38. With that endorsement, MacDonald's attention sharpened. After a short exchange, he invited Lindbergh to join a combat sortie the following day. Lindbergh accepted. To simplify logistics, MacDonald suggested he stay at the 475th camp rather than return to headquarters, eliminating potential transportation delays. As Lindbergh settled onto a spare cot, news of his presence spread rapidly throughout the unit. The fact that Charles Lindbergh was going to fly alongside the notorious Satan's Angels elicited a range of reactions among the pilots. Lieutenant John Perotti of the 433rd Squadron expressed excitement at the opportunity to meet the famed aviator. Others, however, harbored doubts. Some questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, regardless of his renown, could adapt to the rigors of modern aerial combat. Major Thomas Maguire, already credited with 15 confirmed victories and destined to become the second highest-scoring American fighter ace with 38 confirmed kills, was intrigued, eager to observe the newcomer's performance firsthand. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his initial combat sortie in the P-38. Rain fell steadily at 5:30 a.m., casting grey light over the airfield. By the time the flight departed at 10:30, weather conditions had improved enough to permit operations. MacDonald led a formation of 4 P-38 seconds toward Jeffman Island and the nearby Smart Airfield, both frequent targets for the 475th Fighter Group. Lindbergh was assigned Blue 3, flying on Maguire's wing. The 4th aircraft, piloted by Merrill Smith, an 8 Victory Ace, completed the flight group. Observers on the ground noted immediately that Lindbergh adapted quickly to formation flying. Despite having only recently qualified in the P-38, he maintained precise spacing and alignment, integrating seamlessly into the combat formation. The mission's objective was to strafe an enemy barge anchored in Kibos Bay. Lindbergh skillfully navigated through anti-aircraft fire, employing both his cannon and machine guns with accuracy. The sortie concluded successfully, with all 4 fighters returning safely to base. However, it was not combat performance alone that drew attention. After several missions, ground crews discovered a consistent pattern in Lindbergh's P-38 operations. Unlike other pilots, his aircraft regularly returned with noticeably higher fuel reserves, indicating exceptional fuel management and flight efficiency. This observation, more than any individual action in the air, highlighted Lindbergh's remarkable aptitude in handling the P-38 under operational conditions. On July 1st, Lindbergh completed an extended armed reconnaissance over enemy airfields situated along the western shore of Gilvink Bay, a mission that lasted 6.5 hours. Upon returning, his aircraft still contained 210 gallons of fuel, a stark contrast to the other pilots from the same sortie whose tanks were nearly empty. 2 days later, on July 3, the squadron provided escort for 16 B-25 bombers targeting Jeffman Island. Following the bombing run, the Lightnings embarked on a secondary objective, seeking out enemy barges. Within the first hour of this operation, 2 pilots signaled that their fuel levels were critically low and had to disengage. Lindbergh, however, continued without difficulty, reporting substantial reserves. The discrepancy did not go unnoticed. MacDonald, the commanding officer, convened a briefing to address the anomaly. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, Colonel MacDonald assembled the pilots of the 475th in their recreation hall. The room was rudimentary, featuring a dirt floor beneath a palm thatch roof. Furnishings were sparse. A single ping-pong table and a few decks of cards were the only recreational provisions. Beneath unshaded, glaring light bulbs, MacDonald formally introduced Lindbergh to the group and invited him to discuss the unusual fuel efficiency he had demonstrated. What followed would lead to significant operational changes for P-38 pilots across the Pacific Theater. Lindbergh outlined the cruise control strategies he had developed specifically for the Lightning. Standard P-38 procedures instructed pilots to maintain engine speeds between 2200 and 2400 RPM with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. This regimen was considered safe and reliable, providing sufficient power while protecting the engines, but it consumed fuel at a relatively high rate. Lindbergh had discovered that by reducing the engine speed to 1600 rpm, setting the mixture to autolean instead of autorich, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to offset the lower rpm, pilots could substantially extend fuel endurance without sacrificing cruising speed. He recommended a precise combination, 1600 rpm with 30 inches of manifold pressure, the mixture on autolean, and an indicated airspeed of 185 miles per hour. At these settings, fuel consumption could drop to roughly 70 gallons per mission, yielding an efficiency of about 2.6 miles per gallon, far better than conventional cruising settings. Lindbergh projected that this adjustment would extend the P-38's operational radius by approximately 400 miles, allowing sorties of up to 9 hours in duration. The pilots were visibly uneasy as Lindbergh concluded his presentation, which lasted around 30 minutes. Extended missions in the cramped P-38 cockpit were already physically demanding. Pilots had to sit atop their parachutes with emergency rafts and survival gear beneath them and wear restrictive survival suits. 7-hour missions were considered taxing. The idea of remaining aloft for 9 hours seemed almost impossible. More concerning was the nature of Lindbergh's proposed engine management. The method involved operating the engines over square, a condition pilots had been explicitly instructed to avoid. In military training, exceeding the recommended manifold pressure relative to RPM could result in severe detonation, overheating of cylinder heads, and engine destruction. Despite these warnings, Lindbergh was advocating for routine use of these parameters, a suggestion that many in the room found alarming. Skepticism was widespread. Pilots exchanged doubtful looks, some shook their heads, and one even voiced that the technique was dangerously risky. Colonel MacDonald, however, recognized the potential significance of Lindbergh's findings and the advantage they could offer in extending mission range and operational effectiveness. Lindbergh's recommendations were grounded in direct experience rather than theory. He had already applied these settings during actual combat flights, with his P-38 Lightning demonstrating remarkable reliability. Engine failures were virtually non-existent, and missions often concluded with fuel levels that exceeded typical operational expectations. Observing this, the squadron commander saw an opportunity. If Lindbergh's method proved consistently effective, it could provide the 475th Fighter Group with a significant tactical edge. Conversely, if the approach faltered, any shortcomings would become apparent almost immediately. In the following days, squadron pilots began cautiously testing Lindbergh's proposed cruise configurations. Early flights were deliberately brief, minimizing risk and allowing a rapid return if engine performance appeared abnormal. Pilots reported that at the reduced RPMs, the Allison V1710 engines produced a noticeably different acoustic signature. Despite the altered sound, instrumentation showed normal readings. Oil pressure remained steady, temperature gauges were stable, and cylinder head temperatures, the key measure of engine detonation, were actually lower than when flying at conventional higher RPMs. As pilots gained confidence, the technique was gradually applied to longer sorties. The advantages in fuel efficiency became immediately apparent. Operations that previously demanded prompt returns after target engagement could now be extended, allowing additional combat air patrol time. Fuel reserves at mission completion were no longer marginal. Pilots often landed with substantial excess. The Lightning's effective operational range, once limited to approximately 570 miles, extended first to 700 miles, then to 750 miles. Targets once considered beyond reach were now accessible, and pilots could sustain 15-minute engagements over objective areas while retaining enough fuel for an hour of reserve. The results were transformative. Skepticism waned as repeated missions confirmed the method's reliability. Lindbergh regularly flew with the unit, accruing combat hours and demonstrating the approach in action. In flight operations he led, his call sign was simply Mr. Lindbergh, reflecting both his civilian status and the squadron's recognition of his authority. Lindbergh also took time to explain the underlying principles to the pilots, ensuring they understood why the adjustments worked. Aircraft engines generate power by converting fuel into mechanical force through piston movement. Fuel efficiency depends on optimizing the amount of fuel consumed per unit of power produced. Traditional high RPM cruising produced ample power but at the cost of excessive fuel burn as the engine cycled rapidly with each combustion event. By lowering RPM while increasing manifold pressure, similar power output could be maintained with fewer cycles, each consuming fuel more efficiently. Further refinements involved leaning the fuel mixture. This adjustment delivered only the fuel required for complete combustion, eliminating surplus fuel normally added at high power to keep the engine cool. Importantly, these settings did not induce detonation. Although the configuration might seem aggressive by the numbers, actual engine output remained moderate. A manifold pressure of 30 inches was well below the 60-inch war emergency levels used for takeoff or combat maneuvers, and the reduced RPM decreased mechanical wear on components rather than increasing it. The technique was not inherently risky, it simply departed from conventional pilot training. Lindbergh's expertise was rooted in years of experience managing long-distance flights. His 1927 solo transatlantic crossing had already shown him that published aircraft specifications were guidelines rather than fixed limits. His subsequent work with Pan American Airways in the 1932nd surveying routes across the Pacific and Atlantic provided him with thousands of hours to refine methods for fuel economy and endurance flight. The result was a proven, practical system that allowed fighter pilots to operate more efficiently and extend their tactical reach without compromising engine safety. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning offered a distinct operational advantage that made certain experimental flight techniques far less perilous than they might initially have appeared. Its twin-engine design provided redundancy. If one engine were compromised while testing unconventional cruise methods, the second engine could still safely return the aircraft and pilot to base. For pilots operating single-engine fighters over the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, where mechanical failure almost certainly meant either drowning or capture by Japanese forces, flying conservatively was standard practice. In contrast, the P-38 allowed a margin of error that encouraged careful experimentation. Charles Lindbergh, aware of the logistical situation, recognized that the risk was acceptable. Allison Division was supplying ample quantities of spare 1710 engines and replacement components to the Pacific Theater. This meant that any engine damaged or worn during experimental operations could be replaced quickly by ground crews, minimizing operational downtime. The potential benefits of extending mission range through optimized cruise techniques outweighed the relatively small risk of accelerated engine wear. Lindbergh's calculations proved accurate. None of the P-38 engines suffered catastrophic failure as a result of his methods. By late July 1944, the refined cruise procedures had begun to disseminate across 5th Air Force P-38 units. The remarkable performance of the 475th Fighter Group could not go unnoticed. Information spread rapidly between squadrons. Pilots discussed fuel efficiency observations, and maintenance personnel compared consumption records. Commanders sought to replicate the operational edge that Lindbergh's group nicknamed Satan's Angels enjoyed. Lindbergh personally conducted additional briefings for pilots from other units, methodically explaining the procedures, addressing technical inquiries, and alleviating concerns about engine longevity. Adoption of these techniques was gradual and uneven at first, but steadily gained momentum. July 28, 1944 marked a pivotal day for Lindbergh with the 475th. During a bomber escort mission to the Seram region, Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 in a 4-aircraft formation over El Petit Bay alongside the 433rd Squadron. During the flight, enemy aircraft were encountered 2 Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonia light bombers returning from a reconnaissance mission for a missing comrade. These aircraft belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was piloted by the squadron's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, and the other by Sergeant Yakogi. The American P-38 seconds engaged. The Sonias, slower, lightly armed, and less maneuverable than the Lightnings, were at a clear disadvantage. However, Shimada's experience made him a formidable opponent, capable of prolonging the engagement. The encounter quickly evolved into a dynamic, ongoing dogfight. P-38 seconds from the 9th Fighter Squadron had already intercepted the Japanese bombers when Lindbergh's flight arrived. During the engagement, Lieutenant Wade Lewis successfully hit Yokogi's aircraft, igniting its left wing. As the damaged plane attempted to flee, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip followed with a long burst of fire, causing the bomber to dive into the sea in a plume of smoke. Shimada's plane continued to resist. For nearly half an hour, the Japanese captain executed aggressive maneuvers, pushing the Ki-51 through high-rate turns that produced visible condensation along the wingtips. P-38 pilots attempted to maintain targeting, but the American fighters, despite superior speed, could not keep their aim on the nimble bomber. Captain Danforth Miller managed to momentarily align on the target, but Shimada's sudden hard turn foiled the shot, leaving traces falling wide of the mark. Unexpectedly, Shimada then flew directly toward Lindbergh in a near head-on approach at almost 500 miles per hour closing speed. In that instant, Lindbergh, a pilot with thousands of flight hours but no previous combat kills, realized the immediacy of the threat. Focusing on the bomber's radial engine, he opened fire, unleashing 6 seconds of concentrated firepower from the P-38's nose-mounted 20mm cannon and 50 caliber machine guns. The propeller of the Ki-51 visibly slowed under the barrage, smoke pouring from its engine, yet Shimada held his course until Lindbergh pulled up at the final moment, narrowly avoiding collision. Shimada's aircraft entered a steep dive, pursued by other P-38 seconds. Additional bursts hit the stricken bomber, which eventually crashed into the ocean, leaving a frothy splash that quickly dissipated. Both Shimada and his observer perished. At base, pilots debated credit for the kill. While multiple P-38 seconds inflicted damage, it was widely accepted among those present that Lindbergh's head-on assault had critically disabled the bomber. Official records did not acknowledge the kill, as Lindbergh was a civilian attached to the unit in a non-standard capacity. Listing it formally would have raised bureaucratic complications. Only 3 days later, on August 1, Lindbergh narrowly escaped death. During a fighter sweep near the Palau Islands, he encountered Japanese Zeros. In a close-quarters turning engagement, a Zero pilot nearly shot him down. Intervention from Lieutenant MacDonald, who directed Lindbergh to break right and engage the enemy himself, prevented catastrophe. By this point, 5th Air Force leadership concluded that Lindbergh had demonstrated the effectiveness of his methods. Over the course of his Pacific deployment, he had flown roughly 50 combat missions, approximately half of them in P-38 Lightnings with the 475th Fighter Group, successfully validating his cruise techniques under operational conditions. By August 12, 1944, it had become clear that Charles Lindbergh's time in the Pacific needed to conclude. After narrowly surviving enemy fire and contributing directly to combat operations, his presence in Hollandia was no longer necessary. Plans were made to send him back to the United States. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group assembled to bid farewell, their admiration for Lindbergh evident. This respect went beyond his civilian status. He had not only shared technical knowledge to enhance the performance of their 38 aircraft, but he had also flown alongside them, demonstrating firsthand that courage and skill mattered more than rank. Lindbergh's work on fuel conservation transformed the operational capabilities of American fighter units. By October 1944, variations of his recommended cruise control methods were adopted across P-38 squadrons throughout the Pacific theater. While each unit adjusted the numbers slightly to suit their specific conditions, the underlying principles were consistent: operate at lower RPMs, increase manifold pressure, and maintain a leaner fuel mixture. This approach significantly extended the aircraft's range, with far-reaching tactical and strategic consequences. Targets that were previously beyond reach could now be engaged. Japanese airfields that had once been safe from long-range fighter escorts became vulnerable to sustained attacks. Extended operational range allowed fighters to accompany bombers on missions that had either been too risky to attempt or had previously required them to fly unescorted. 38 units operating in Dutch New Guinea were now able to cover distances of nearly 950 miles to reach their objectives, engage the enemy for meaningful periods, and return safely. Missions of this length had been inconceivable before these fuel-saving techniques became standard practice. The advantages were not solely measured in miles. The new procedures accelerated the pace of operations, directly supporting General MacArthur's campaign toward the Philippines. Forward airfields that had been previously unusable now became viable, allowing ground forces to advance more rapidly. The ability to project fighter power over greater distances reduced delays caused by the need for closer staging bases, compressing what might have been months of operations into a matter of weeks. In addition to strategic gains, the techniques provided critical safety benefits. Pilots who formerly arrived back at base with near-empty fuel tanks now carried a buffer for unexpected events. Weather-induced detours no longer guaranteed the loss of aircraft, and combat-damaged planes had a higher probability of returning safely. The additional fuel margin mitigated non-combat losses and improved the overall survivability of both men and machines. The practical value of these methods became especially apparent during the liberation of the Philippines. When Allied forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, 38s from New Guinea and Morotai were able to provide continuous fighter coverage over distances that had been out of reach months earlier. The difference between reaching a target with virtually no reserve fuel and reaching it with enough for an extra hour of operations was decisive. It determined whether fighters could actively protect bombers or merely be present in name. Despite these clear benefits, adoption of Lindbergh's recommendations faced some resistance. Certain commanders questioned engine reliability under the new settings, while some pilots trusted their existing training more than a civilian's guidance. Maintenance personnel also expressed concerns about potential long-term engine wear. Nonetheless, the empirical evidence was compelling. Squadrons employing Lindbergh's techniques reported no increase in mechanical failures, while fuel consumption figures demonstrated measurable improvements. Mission records confirmed operations previously thought impossible, validating the efficacy of his approach and solidifying its place in the Pacific Air Campaign. By the latter part of 1944, Charles Lindbergh's method for managing cruise efficiency had been formally integrated into the operational procedures for the P-38 Lightning. What began as the observation of a civilian technical consultant had evolved into an established standard for pilots. The United States Army Air Force's updated official cruise control charts to reflect Lindbergh's findings, and instructional materials for pilot training were revised to emphasize the importance of operating the aircraft's mixture at lean of peak settings. Lindbergh's service in the Pacific reveals a man whose motivations were multifaceted. Before the war, his outspoken isolationist views and commentary on German aviation technology had made him a controversial figure in the United States. Critics accused him of harboring sympathies for the Nazis, and his public opposition to American involvement in World War II had strained, if not destroyed, his relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. When the United States entered the conflict, Lindbergh's reputation in Washington was tarnished, and he was effectively sidelined despite his extraordinary accomplishments as an aviator. However, in the Pacific theater, removed from the political pressures of the capital, Lindbergh's technical expertise allowed him to regain respect. Pilots from both the Marine Corps and the Army Air Forces judged him by his skill in the cockpit rather than his past political positions. Major Richard Bong, the United States' top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories while serving in the Pacific, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as capable a pilot as any of us, noting that he would have been actively engaged in combat had regulations permitted. Praise from an aviator of Bong's caliber carried far more weight than any political rehabilitation could have provided. In the arena of combat, Lindbergh had demonstrated his value unequivocally. Upon returning to the U.S., in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued contributing to the war effort in a technical capacity. In October, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland, where he flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing detailed assessments of enemy capabilities. Additionally, he maintained his consultancy with United Aircraft and other manufacturers, offering solutions to operational challenges that arose during combat missions. The impact of Lindbergh's contributions can be quantified in the performance improvements of the P-38J Lightning. Standard internal fuel included two 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserve tanks, and two 55-gallon leading-edge tanks with provisions for additional external drop tanks, giving a total capacity exceeding 1,000 gallons. At the standard cruise setting of 2,200 RPM with an auto-rich mixture, the aircraft consumed significantly more fuel than it did under Lindbergh's methodology. By adjusting engine operation to lean of peak mixture, Lindbergh reduced total fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour. This optimization extended the P-38's combat radius from around 570 miles to roughly 750 miles without reducing combat or reserve allowances, a 31% increase. For maximum range missions, combining his cruise techniques with extra drop tanks allowed flights lasting up to 9 hours, covering distances over 1,000 miles. These gains substantially enhanced the operational flexibility of Allied forces in the Pacific. The strategic campaign of island hopping, central to General MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and the Philippines, depended on air superiority at each stage. Fighter range dictated which islands could be bypassed and which required direct assault to establish forward airfields. By extending the operational radius of the P-38, Lindbergh enabled planners to consider bolder strategies, allowing some heavily defended islands to be bypassed entirely, as fighters could reach their targets from more distant bases. It is important to clarify that some historians have mistakenly attributed Lindbergh's range extension techniques to the April 1943 mission against Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron from Guadalcanal. While that operation tested the Lightning's extreme range, Lindbergh was not involved, as he did not arrive in the Pacific until over a year later. His true contribution was to make such extended-range operations routine rather than rare and exceptional. Lindbergh's personal endurance further underscores the significance of his accomplishments. At 42 years old, he undertook combat flights against pilots 2 decades his junior. The physical demands were severe: long hours in cramped cockpits, exposure to extreme heat and cold, and the intense stress of aerial combat all exacted a toll. Yet through a combination of technical mastery and personal courage, Lindbergh not only demonstrated the practical benefits of his innovations, but also earned the respect of those who flew alongside him, leaving a lasting mark on the Pacific Air War. Charles Augustus Lindbergh never demanded preferential treatment during his wartime service. He undertook the same perilous sorties, followed identical operational protocols, and faced the same dangers as the young lieutenants and captains who formed the backbone of the 475th Fighter Group. His credibility did not come from rank or reputation. It emerged from his readiness to validate his fuel management strategies firsthand. Had he remained at headquarters lecturing abstractly about engine efficiency and fuel conservation, frontline pilots would likely have dismissed him as another theorist detached from the realities of combat aviation. By actively participating in missions and demonstrating that his methods consistently worked, Lindbergh earned a level of trust that no official title or public recognition could have conferred. This practical approach extended beyond mere fuel management. It highlighted the operational value of civilian expertise in a military context. During World War II, armed forces often prioritized chain of command experience over technical knowledge. Yet modern aerial warfare demanded precision and innovation, frequently found outside traditional military structures. Lindbergh's work proved that civilians with specialized skills could make substantial contributions to combat effectiveness when allowed to operate alongside professional military units. His success prompted commanders to increasingly consider input from civilian engineers, manufacturers, and technical advisors, fostering a collaborative environment between military personnel and civilian experts. This synergy accelerated technological improvements across aircraft design, engine performance, and operational tactics. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning itself played a pivotal role in Lindbergh's achievements. Its twin-engine design offered redundancy that made experimental flight procedures safer, while the Allison Vaughn 1710 engines, though prone to certain issues, responded effectively to meticulous fuel mixture adjustments. The P-38's complex fuel system, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps, allowed pilots to optimize fuel consumption, and its inherent stability suited extended cruise operations. By late 1944, the P-51 Mustang began to replace the P-38 in some theaters due to superior high-altitude performance and longer operational range. However, in the Pacific, the P-38's combination of twin-engine reliability, potent armament, and maneuverability at low and medium altitudes ensured its continued strategic relevance. When flown using Lindbergh's methods, the aircraft's operational range expanded significantly, enabling longer, safer missions. The operational record of the 475th Fighter Group underscores the impact of these innovations. Flying exclusively P-38 seconds, the unit achieved 551 confirmed aerial victories, making it the most successful P-38 formation of the conflict. Major Thomas Maguire, the second highest-scoring American ace with 38 victories, also flew P-38 seconds with the 475. The aircraft's combination of endurance, firepower, and reliability, amplified by Lindbergh's fuel-saving techniques, enhanced every aspect of combat operations. Missions extended farther, engagements lasted longer, and pilots returned more safely. Over thousands of sorties and countless flight hours, the cumulative effect of these techniques was profound, if not always easily quantified. Lindbergh's path to service was far from conventional. His pre-war political stances had rendered him ineligible for formal military enlistment, and personal friction with President Roosevelt barred him from uniformed service. Yet his expertise was precisely what the Army Air Force needed. The solution, a civilian designation with informal authorization to fly combat missions, bypassed bureaucratic restrictions, a workaround that would likely violate current military regulations but proved operationally invaluable. Practical needs outweighed institutional rigidity, and the war effort benefited enormously as a result. The lessons Lindbergh imparted endured long after the war. Pilots of the 475th spoke decades later with deep respect for the civilian who had flown shoulder to shoulder with them, teaching them to achieve greater range than they previously believed possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, commander of the 432nd Squadron, could recite Lindbergh's precise fuel-saving settings years later. While minor adaptations varied by aircraft model and mission, the principles and outcomes remained universal and unquestioned. Charles Augustus Lindbergh passed away on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72, succumbing to lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. He had discreetly left only 15 people attended, and his marker, a simple concrete slab, bore an inscription from Psalm 139, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." His wartime journals, released in 1970, document his experiences in the Pacific Theater, including his transformative service with the 475th Fighter Group, preserving a legacy of technical innovation, practical. Charles Lindbergh's involvement in the Pacific Theater left a legacy that went far beyond the specific methods he demonstrated. He exemplified enduring principles that remain relevant to both military operations and technical problem-solving. Expertise in specialized technical areas can have decisive impact in combat settings. Civilian experts, when given access and trust, can contribute significantly to operational outcomes. Standard procedures and institutional norms are not immutable. They should be evaluated critically and adjusted when evidence indicates better alternatives. Moreover, practical demonstration often carries more persuasive power than theoretical argument alone. Above all, Lindbergh's work underscores the notion that no system is ever fully optimized. Continuous improvement is always possible. In practical terms, Lindbergh's contribution addressed one of the most pressing challenges of the Pacific War: the extreme range demands placed on fighter aircraft. Existing operational procedures routinely imposed limitations that were well below the aircraft's technical potential. Lindbergh brought decades of detailed knowledge in fuel management and efficiency, honed originally through his record-setting transatlantic flights. Combat conditions in 1944 provided a unique opportunity to apply this expertise, producing measurable results under real-world stress. By personally demonstrating his techniques, often risking his own safety, Lindbergh proved that theoretical efficiency could translate directly into operational advantage. Importantly, he engaged with the pilots as a colleague rather than seeking deference or acclaim, which facilitated the rapid adoption of his methods. Just as German prisoners of war had witnessed the transformative power of American industrial production and returned home with a new understanding of democratic abundance, Lindbergh's work exemplified how technical knowledge could reshape performance. American pilots who absorbed his techniques gained the ability to extend their missions, conserve fuel, and return safely, improvements that directly enhanced operational effectiveness across the theater. The P-38 Lightning continued to serve throughout the Pacific Campaign, its unmistakable twin-boom profile symbolizing American air power. Pilots who flew the aircraft in 1944 recalled it with fondness despite its operational quirks, and they remembered the civilian who had expanded their understanding of its capabilities. Lindbergh demonstrated that many perceived limitations were not immutable, and that mastery of the aircraft could unlock performance far beyond published specifications. His role was not defined by celebrity or by the missions flown, but by the dissemination of knowledge and the cultivation of skill. He arrived as an observer and departed as a mentor, leaving a lasting imprint on the pilots and their operational doctrine. For the squadron known as Satan's Angels, Lindbergh's lessons were transformative. By mastering and sharing techniques in fuel conservation and flight optimization, he enabled pilots to extend their operational reach, fight longer engagements, and return safely. This practical knowledge, validated under combat conditions and then adopted broadly, became one of the most significant technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. Remarkably, this advancement did not emerge from laboratories or engineering bureaus, but from one individual's long-standing mastery of aircraft efficiency skills he had perfected 17 years earlier over the Atlantic. Applied in a new context and on a different aircraft, that expertise proved just as crucial in 1944 as it had in 1927. The underlying principle was consistent: a complete understanding of one's aircraft, meticulous resource management, and refusal to accept prescribed limits as absolute. Lindbergh embodied this principle, and over 6 weeks in the summer of 1944, he imparted it to some of the Pacific's most capable fighter pilots. These pilots, in turn, became vectors for the knowledge, spreading it further and fundamentally changing how the United States conducted its air operations in the Pacific. Lindbergh's legacy, therefore, is measured not in combat sorties or mission counts, but in the knowledge transferred, the techniques institutionalized, and the operational capabilities enhanced through the application of rigorous expertise.